Ray Dalio, the billionaire who predicted the 2008 financial crisis, just dropped a bombshell warning that should terrify every American. The man who's been right about every major economic disaster for 50 years is saying we're heading straight into a debt crisis that could destroy the dollar as we know it. And here's the kicker, he's comparing Trump's policies to what happened in the 1930s right before democracies collapsed into autocracy. This isn't just another economic prediction, this is a roadmap to potential financial apocalypse. Stay with me because what you're about to hear will change how you think about money, politics, and the future of America.
The big, beautiful bill, as Trump calls it, has passed the House. The Senate's now wrestling with it. It seems like it would add maybe $2.4 trillion to the deficit, and by the last estimates. Is that a really bad thing? Should we worry about that bill adding too much to the deficit?
I think that if there's one thing I can give people, and I'm compelled to give people now, it's an understanding of the mechanics and the supply demand so that people will understand how to answer that question, which is why, as a global investor for 50 years who's been through many of these, I wanted to pass along, my book, my description of the mechanics. So in answering your question, I want to say why it's a compelling moment, and that if they do not bring it down to 3% of GDP from where it'll be about 7% of GDP, they have to bring it down by 4% of GDP, that there is very high likelihood of real problems.
Let me break this down in simple terms because this is absolutely critical. Right now, America's deficit is running at about 7% of GDP. That's like spending $7 for every $100 you make while only earning $3. Dalio is saying we need to cut this by more than half, down to 3% of GDP. That's a $4 trillion reduction needed. To put this in perspective, the entire federal budget is about $6 trillion, so we're talking about cutting 2/3 of government spending or raising taxes by an astronomical amount. This isn't just belt-tightening, this is economic surgery without anesthesia. The real problems he's referring to: think hyperinflation, currency collapse, and social unrest. This is the kind of math that has historically led to the fall of empires.
Now, you say you got to bring it down by more than half the amount of the deficit. Can that be done with spending cuts alone, or do you think they should let some of the tax cuts expire?
It has to be done by three things. There is, and it has to be spread out among these three things, because any one of those three things would be too painful. And those three things are tax revenue, spending cuts, and interest rates. Although Congress and the president and the process does not deal directly with the third of those, right now $1 trillion, half of our deficit, is interest payments. And not only do we have $1 trillion interest payments, in the next year, we have $9 trillion of debt maturing that has to be either rolled over or sold.
This is where things get absolutely terrifying. We're already spending $1 trillion just on interest. That's more than we spend on defense, education, or healthcare. But here's the real kicker. We have $9 trillion in debt that's coming due and needs to be refinanced. Imagine having to refinance your mortgage every year, but each time the interest rate goes up. That's what's happening to America right now. We're in what economists call a debt trap. We're borrowing money just to pay the interest on money we already borrowed. This is the exact same spiral that destroyed countries like Greece, Argentina, and Venezuela. The difference is, when America goes down, it takes the entire global financial system with it.
Well, wait, doesn't that mean interest rates are going to not go down if we're adding more to the deficit and I have all this expiring?
That's right. So there is what I call my 3% three-part solution, which was very similar to 1991 to 98, it was cut by 5% of GDP. The budget deficit in those years was cut by 5% of GDP by spreading it around. So the three things are needed. So if there's a mantra that about 4%, here's the magnitudes of it. About 4%, if it came from tax revenue, doesn't mean tax rates, but it could be tax revenue. 4% was cut from the budget deficit. That would naturally change the supply-demand picture to bring down interest rates by 1 to 1.5%, which would itself reduce the deficit by another 2% or so.
But let me push on that question of how are you going to raise more revenues? You say it's not just by allowing tax cuts to expire, but don't some of those tax cuts have to expire if your 333 solution is going to work?
Where it comes is a political question. In other words, yes, you can let the tax expire, or so many different ways. You can do so many different ways.
Well, let me ask, what would you do? You're one of the wealthiest people. The tax cuts help you. What would you do in terms of those tax cuts that are for the wealthy?
I would allow important tax increases in a way that also, my own view would be improve education, improve productivity in a way that raises productivity for most people, and so on. But this is not my political. Okay, I want to say whether you turn left or you turn right. What I'm seeing when I go down there, and I speak to both sides of Congress, who are the people who are responsible for this. Nobody disagrees with the need to go to 3% of GDP in that number. And what I'm seeing in politics is that there is, it's like being on a ship that's headed to rocks. And there are those who want to turn right and those who want to turn left. And they're so hell-bent on arguing of whether they turn right or left that they will not get past, they're going to hit the rocks.
President Trump seems to be trying to jawbone the Fed chairman, Jay Powell, into cutting interest rates. Does that make any sense to try to jawbone that? And would the bond market permit that?
If interest rates are unnaturally cut by the central bank printing money or pushing down interest rates unnaturally, the bond market will not want to own that. Think about when you're owning a bond, what you're getting is interest rates. So the dollar will go down, the value of money will go down, and it's discouraging.
On Sunday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that tariffs would help bring in enough money that we wouldn't end up having as big of a deficit. Does that ring true to you?
We're now in a world geopolitical situation that relates to many things such as self-sufficiency and so on. It can bring in a lot of money. It also creates a less efficient world economy. Well, so how the deficits or how the tariffs are put into place, what amounts how, has to be done scientifically to get away with that tax revenue. So tax revenue can come from that, but that is a matter of surgery, and it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done moderately so as to not disrupt that. I'm concerned about that, but that is not going to be enough.
Here's where Dalio politely destroys the Trump administration's tariff strategy. Yes, tariffs can generate revenue, but they're not a magic bullet. If you implement them too aggressively, you create inflation, reduce economic efficiency, and potentially trigger trade wars. More importantly, even if you implemented the most aggressive tariff regime in history, it wouldn't come close to solving a $4 trillion deficit problem. This is like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose while there's a massive hole in the bottom. The math simply doesn't work, and anyone telling you otherwise is either lying or doesn't understand basic economics.
In your book, by the way, you are in favor of some tariffs moderately applied in a scientific way that's not just helter-skelter. Explain why you're in favor of that and why you think the way Trump is doing it may not be effective.
We have a giant imbalance. The world, the United States, is the largest consumer in the world. And it's largely because the US government gets in debt and distributes the money, and it's a consumer. As we have correctly, we've lost our ability to manufacture. China is the largest manufacturer in the world and is in the other side of that. They lend us the money to borrow to buy their goods, and now we have a big imbalance. We have a capital imbalance and we have a trade imbalance between that in a world that there's a risk of going to war. And so as we deal with self-sufficiency, increasingly, we have to become more self-sufficient. It's a reality in this, and we have to become more balanced in that, one way or another. So if that's done economically, we have a population that is not productive and manufacturing. We now have a great polarity of wealth. 60% of Americans have below a sixth grade reading level. And there's a productivity problem and there's an economic problem. So if that is dealt with in a scientific and a balanced way, that could have some benefits. It's not a black and white situation, but it has to be done with that kind of thoroughness and so on. One way or another, the imbalances will go away. The debt imbalances, the trade imbalances, the capital imbalances, because they cannot be sustained in the world that now exists. So that it's coming to an end.
Wait, when you say the one way or the other, they'll go away, that sort of the other sounds pretty ominous to me. What are you worried about?
I'm worried about let's go back to the debt. I'm worried about that the demand for those bonds will not be equal to the supply. And I'm worried that as the debt now is at this point where it starts to, you have to acquire debt to service debt.
This is the nuclear option scenario that keeps economists awake at night. When the bond market loses confidence in your ability to repay, they stop buying your debt. This is what happened to Greece in 2010. One day they could borrow money at reasonable rates, the next day nobody wanted their bonds. For America, this would be catastrophic because the entire global financial system is built on the assumption that U.S. Treasury bonds are the safest investment in the world. If that assumption breaks down, every pension fund, every bank, every insurance company would face massive losses simultaneously. We're talking about a global financial crisis that would make 2008 look like a minor correction.
You have to borrow money to service it, $10 trillion a year in debt service. That when you have that kind of condition, that you will have an unsustainable situation, so that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, will be put into a position of either being seeing interest rates rise a lot because of that problem, crowding out other spending, and costing it money because they own a lot of bonds, and letting that happen, or then having to print money and buy those bonds, which depreciates the value. Very similar to the 1970s.
Do you think then there's a chance or a likelihood of a recession?
We're certainly going to have, we always have recessions. Now, just imagine what happens if you have a recession. On average, since 1945, when the New World Order began, we've had 12 and a half cycles, of which there have always been recessions. You're always going to have a recession. I am very worried that this set of circumstances will assuredly, we will have a recession. And then the deficits go up. And then it's very difficult at that time because people are at each other's throats. So there's going to be an internal fight. The important thing is to deal with this now, okay? Before you have a lot more debt, before you have a lot more compounding of the debt, before you have a recession,
Let me read you a sentence from the book, your book, that kind of made me snap my head. It says, quote, "The policies President Trump is using to, quote, make America great again are remarkably like the policies that those of the hard right countries in the 1930s used."
This is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire interview. Dalio isn't making a partisan political statement, he's making a historical observation. In the 1930s, when countries faced debt crises and economic dysfunction, people became desperate for someone to take control and fix things. This is exactly how Hitler came to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and Franco in Spain. The pattern is always the same: economic crisis leads to political dysfunction, which leads to people demanding strong leadership, which leads to the erosion of democratic institutions. Dalio is essentially saying that America is following this exact same playbook right now. The scariest part? He's not saying this might happen, he's saying it is happening.
Tell me what you mean by that.
What I mean by that is the 1930s was a period that had a debt crisis. The governments were dysfunctional, and four democracies chose to go to more autocratic policies for somebody to get control of the situation in order to fix the situation. So that you had a debt problem. What Germany did, and a number of countries, is that they essentially defaulted on the debt. They didn't pay the debt, and then you have that more autocratic type of policy because the people want somebody to get control of this situation. And then you have the classic conflict between the left and the right. Okay, this has happened repeatedly, the left and the right. And then you have a fight between the left and the right. This has happened repeatedly. I'm referring to the 30s, but this has happened repeatedly throughout history.
And do you think that it's happening now in the United States, that we're slipping towards an autocracy?
Yes, I do, because somebody to get control of this thing. And so what you see it yourself, we're now questioning, there's a challenge. How does the legal system work? Who has what rights? The possibility of if there was a not accepting an election result. These things are very real today.
When you talk about perhaps we're moving into an autocracy, there's another sentence in your book that struck me, which is, as shown in history, the transfer of power from democracy to autocracy was more often than not orderly within the democracy, because people were sick and tired of the system failing to work and wanted to give power to a leader who would take control of the mass and make it work well. Do you think it's partly a desire of people in the United States to move to a more autocratic system?
There is a very clear, strong desire for somebody to get control of this, and a willingness to have that more autocratic type of to deliver those results. Yes, I think so.
When you talk about the potential of getting more revenues, I think in your book, you even talk about maybe having a 2% increase in the income tax. Would you make that part of your 333 solution package?
Sure.
And what about
I think what's required is a little bit from everybody and everything.
And what about the expenditure cuts? Would you cut the military?
I think as you go down that prioritization, these are questions that are political questions that have now, because of our debt service being so high, we have very little room to cut anything that we don't think is essential. So now you're having the representatives in Congress having to make that choice, but they better make the choice as to whether it's the military or whether it's something else or something else and something else. I don't really care. Cut it, get to something like a 4% cut, and that's not easy. So where that happens, because if we lose our economic well-being, if we lose our health economically and our power economically, if we lose the dollar as a world reserve currency, it reverberates through not only American power around the world, it reverberates through the world, because the dollar, the U.S. bond market, the treasury market, is the backbone of all markets. And so could produce that kind of trauma. So how they get there in the particular trade-offs are for those experts and those representatives in Washington to weigh those considerations. It's not for me to weigh those considerations.
Well, if you're going to have something that's a 3-3-3 solution, that would seem to require a grand bargain. One of those things where Democrats and Republicans meet and do the trade-offs. Those used to be done in the days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, for example. Our politics seems unsuited to that now. Do you think a grand bargain is possible?
I don't think it's likely that we're going to have any grand bargain until after the 2026 midterm elections. I think that this is what's going to happen. The budget will pass. It'll be this situation that I'm describing. And then what my hope would be is that there's a mandatory bipartisan solution, that they create the equivalent of a Manhattan Projects and so on, and create a mandatory bipartisan way of dealing with that. Do I think that's likely? I don't think it's likely. I think that, but if we don't achieve a bipartisan situation, we're going to have a financial crisis and be fighting with each other. So hopefully the compelling nature of this, before we have a recession, which will make that situation worse.
Ray Dalio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
What Ray Dalio is describing isn't just another economic downturn, it's a potential civilizational inflection point. The numbers don't lie. America is trapped in a debt spiral that has historically led to currency collapse, social unrest, and political transformation. The $36 trillion debt isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it's a loaded gun pointed at the heart of American democracy. The most terrifying aspect of this crisis is that it's completely predictable and entirely preventable, yet our political system seems incapable of addressing it. We have Republicans who treat any tax increase as heresy and Democrats who view spending cuts as cruel, while the mathematical reality demands both in massive quantities. This isn't about ideology anymore, it's about survival. Dalio's comparison to the 1930s should send chills down every American spine. We're not just facing an economic crisis, we're facing a potential transition away from democracy itself. When people become desperate enough, they'll trade freedom for the promise of stability. This is exactly how every autocracy in history has begun. The bond market rebellion that Dalio warns about would be unprecedented in modern history. If global investors lose confidence in America's ability to service its debt, the resulting chaos would make the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Every retirement account, every bank deposit, every insurance policy would be at risk. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency would evaporate overnight, triggering a global economic collapse. But here's what makes this even more dangerous. Unlike previous debt crises, this one is happening in an era of extreme political polarization and social media-driven misinformation. The social cohesion that helped America weather past crises no longer exists. Instead, we have a population that can't even agree on basic facts, let alone unite around the painful sacrifices needed to solve this crisis. The window for a gradual, managed solution is rapidly closing. Every day we delay action, the eventual reckoning becomes more severe. Dalio's three-part solution, tax increases, spending cuts, and controlled interest rates, is mathematically sound but politically impossible in our current system. This is the paradox of democratic decline. The very institutions that could solve the crisis are too broken to implement the solution. The implications extend far beyond America's borders. If the U.S. economy collapses, it triggers a global depression that would make the 1930s look mild by comparison. China would likely emerge as the dominant global power, potentially ending the era of democratic leadership worldwide. The geopolitical consequences would reshape human civilization for generations. This isn't fearmongering, it's mathematical reality. The debt crisis is already here, we're just experiencing the calm before the storm. The question isn't whether this crisis will unfold, but how quickly and how violently it will happen. Those who understand what's coming have a chance to prepare. Those who don't will be swept away by forces they never saw coming. The time for political games and partisan bickering is over. America faces an existential threat that requires the kind of national unity and sacrifice we haven't seen since World War II. The question is, are we still capable of that kind of collective action, or have we already passed the point of no return?